As the coronavirus pandemic slowly subsides, college campuses are rethinking their space requirements to adjust to uncertain student enrollments and remote learning trends. Joining us today to discuss campus planning is Mike Aziz, a partner and director of urban design at Cooper Robertson. Mike is also an alumnus of our magazine's 40 Under 40 class of 2019. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. Mike, how has your firm's conversations with colleges and universities changed in the last year, and how have those clients' needs changed?
Well, John, it's fair to say that we've never seen anything like this. It's completely upended operations and planning for all of our clients, um, small to large institutions, public to private. It's really been across the board. Um, Even back in 2008, during the last recession, things were quite different. As it goes, institutions, when they really don't have the capacity to build, often plan, and so we saw a little bit of a uptick actually in the amount of master planning and campus planning work during that period. But this was different. At least the first 6 or 8 months of it were very different. It was this combination of rapid fire triage and stasis at the same time. It was really like both happening. We have to move. The institutions had to move so quickly to respond to the crisis, to get their students online into hybrid learning, find a way to make campuses safe, following the guidelines as they were constantly being updated. But at the same time, there's so many things they couldn't move forward with because there was just so much uncertainty about where things were going. So it was a lot of working with our clients on creative solutions, short-term gaps that could potentially be there for some time as improvements to the campus, and finding ways to implement them in a really expeditious and cost-effective way. Their focus was really on, initially, was just continuity of service, of teaching for the students, of all the community resources that they provide, health and safety, and then just making sure the facilities were being managed properly as they emptied out all of their halls, the residential halls and academic halls. You can't just kind of throw mothballs into those things and wait for it to come back. Like, you've got these are big facilities that need to have some care while they're dormant, so to speak. So it was just kind of figuring that out on the fly. Mm-hmm. The tide really began to turn in late last year when the vaccines were announced. It was a light at the end of the tunnel. It is around the time that institutions would typically start planning for the fall of the following year as well. So, I think that was a real inflection point for a lot of our clients and a lot of higher ed institutions, when they could move from, like I said before, kind of this triage planning to more recovering and finding ways to maybe even bounce forward a little bit through all of this. And so for planning efforts that we had underway that started before the pandemic and carried through it, there was a big shift in focus too. A gear shift from being less specific about exactly what would happen next, what capital project would be followed by what capital projects, and a little bit more of a focus on adaptability, flexibility, for their capital planning and academic planning, for that matter. All of that stuff just sort of took a different focus.
The education sector is part of a larger construction ecosystem that was going through its own problems simultaneously.
Yeah, yeah.
How did educational institutions adjust their planning in light of such things as rising land costs, revenue shortfalls, enrollment patterns and learning preferences, and more to the point, labor and material costs that were going through the roof?
Yeah, and
Uh,
yeah, yeah, and they've continued to escalate too,
yeah.
through all of this. I mean, the what grabs the headlines the most in the newspaper is the reduction in operational costs. Restructuring of staff and faculty at the university, cutbacks there, consolidation of services and program offerings. I mean, those cuts are real, and we don't know when they'll be rolled back and to what degree they will be. But that's one place that a lot of these big institutions turn to early on. Um,
They're not like museums where they can sell art off. I mean,
they don't have that ability, but um, they do have the larger public systems. We saw this in Connecticut a few years ago. I was working for the Connecticut um, system of colleges and universities. It's about 16 different institutions all under one umbrella, and they in Connecticut for some years had flatlined um, in terms of enrollment. It was really a reflection of the decline in birth rates over many decades. And they proactively began to consolidate some of their units. So
mm,
you would still have separate community colleges, for example, but they might share the same administrative staff. You may have one president for two or three community colleges. And so I would expect to see more of that in the coming years. The consolidation in larger systems of overhead, of administrative overhead, to try to streamline things. Other ways that institutions, I think, will respond to this will be to look at alternative revenue streams.
mm.
P3 development has been something that institutions have been doing for some time now, but I
Yeah.
imagine that we'll see um, an uptick, monetization of their, of peripheral assets of properties that they may have been holding on to for some time, on the edge of the perimeter of their campus without a real clear direction about what to be used for. It's often parking or some kind of support service.
Yeah, I just did a story about UC Merced out in California that has been expanding rapidly, but they're surrounded by open land that
Yeah,
they could probably sell off if they needed to.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah, and so I think you'll see a lot. I think you'll see commercial investment. As urban institutions have been doing this for years with long-term land leases to developers where they still own the dirt, but they have an opportunity to monetize it for some period of time. I think you're right. I think larger land grant institutions and ones in more bucolic settings that just had the luxury of sort of gobbling up properties over time
mm.
will now interrogate those holdings a little bit and say, is this property that we could that has a higher and better use for the institution?
Have you seen
Um,
any evidence of universities or colleges scaling back their plans because they're a little nervous about availability of labor, availability of materials, availability of anything? Hmm.
um, I've definitely seen a shift in the last few years to in planning to prioritize an adaptive reuse
Mm.
strategies and limiting growth. I've actually worked on some no growth master plans
Oh,
where
interesting.
where there may be the it's a little bit of a misnomer, but the idea that there are going to be facilities that will inevitably come down over time after they reach their useful life, but in some total over 10 years the institution actually needs less space but just better space. um, and so in effect you have a no growth or a slight contraction in space over time when you look at what the enrollment projections would be for an institution. It varies greatly by the type of institution you're talking about, of course. But yeah, I think you'll see a lot more prioritization of using your space that you have in a better way, shrinking your overall footprint. You're taking some support services and putting them in satellite locations or offloading them completely,
Mhm.
like we see in a lot of commercial and corporate planning.
Yeah.
Um, a
Mm.
lot of that I think you'll see.
What other manifestations post COVID do you think are going to stick at campuses?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question right now.
Uh,
John. I think a lot of it is going to depend on this next generation of college students,
mm,
of students that had a year in high school or more now, of hybrid learning or at home learning completely. What are those students going to think about the college experience is kind of an unknown. Will they want to stay closer to home? Will they want to go to a school uh, that is going to offer hybrid learning on equal footing with on-campus learning? Will we see less international students now because there's been this kind of circuit break in this year of that flow of international students in because of travel restrictions? Will that trend pick back up to where it was before? We know that's a big piece of the higher ed puzzle. Um, will students avoid higher density urban areas, for fear of another pandemic or public health
oh, that's an
issues?
interesting point. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, um, I don't know. I mean, we just don't know. It's really in the minds of those high school students right now. And so I think what that all means is that you're going to see, as I mentioned before, I think you'll see a step away from the more detailed facility master planning that would say in the next 10 years you're going to build this building first. Going to be about this size and this location. It's going to be followed by this building and then this building. I think you'll see less of that, and I think you'll see more of what we kind of call framework planning.
Hmm.
It was something that we brought to Yale University in the early 2000s. When we started to work with Yale, the then president, Rick Levin, said, I haven't a clue what Yale is going to look like in 5 years. Please don't ask me about 10 years or 20. Now, and keep in mind, this is early 2000s. The pace of innovation was nothing like what we see now.
Right.
I looked it up earlier. Cameras and phones were still two separate things. Mark Zuckerberg was still in high school. The Prius had not been invented. It was still just something in a Latin dictionary. Like it was just a different time. And now the pace of change is just so accelerated that we're doing a lot more of that for institutions. And so what the framework plan for Yale said was that the character, the scale of the Yale campus in New Haven is such a special thing. That's what the campus planning should be really focused on preserving over time. And the plan itself uh, almost said more about where you don't build and what you don't do than exactly what you're going to do. So it laid out a plan of development that said here are development sites. These are better for residential, or these are better for academic, these are better for administrative, but not a lot of detail on them. And then here are key open spaces to preserve, enhance, improve over time. And then here are places that you really connect back to the city, like all the really important things that will help Yale, thrive for another 100 years.
Hmm.
But it wasn't, and it is still. I went to a conference, actually the last conference before the lockdown at Yale, a SCUP conference, and and they said very proudly, we haven't done a master plan in 21 years since Cooper Robertson did one. It's still the book that we give architects when they come to campus to work. It's still the book that we refer to when we want to figure out where the next building should go, because it was that flexible and could endure for that a period of time. So I
Mm.
think you're going to see a lot more of that because there are just so many unknowns right now. It it just behooves the university to look at things in a different way for the next couple of years, at least.
Are you working on anything currently that you can share some information about what a problem and solution?
Yeah, I mean, uh, we're working on a few master plans now, all of which have just gone straight through the pandemic. So there's some interesting lessons that we've learned about, I think, where trends will be going. The pandemic, I think, was less of um, in a lot of ways, was less of a disruptor for trends than it was an accelerant for,
Hmm.
as we said, some your previous question about what are some these issues have been bubbling up for some time in higher ed. So some of the things that we've seen really emerge as important to universities. Um, the kind of breaking down of silos across universities academically is really important. We're working at George Washington University right now, and we did a kind of diagnostic of the campus, a sort of academic geography of it. And what we realized is it's essentially it's spread across a grid in downtown Washington, the
Hmm.
Foggy Bottom campus. It's a few blocks from the White House, and more or less you have the sciences and the School of Medicine and engineering on one half of campus, and on the other half of campus you have the things the GW has long been known for: law, the arts, journalism, all the things that sort of typify Washington in a lot of ways. And dividing them was this corridor that was established in the early L'Enfant plan, 22nd Street, that is a really important corridor for the city, but also divides the campus into these two halves. So what our plan ended up doing was recommending that that corridor become an innovation corridor. And
Oh.
along that corridor, you only build buildings that are multidisciplinary and bridge that divide. So you have learning spaces that have both an influence of the arts, uh, of law, of journalism, of those sort of humanitarian programs with the engineering and the medicine. And so the library happens to be on that corridor. Perhaps a new student center will be located on that corridor, and some flagship new learning buildings. And so,
Are
that
there commercial buildings on the corridor as well?
there are commercial buildings at the northern end of that corridor. It's an example of uh, that commercial investment we talked about that the GW some years ago
Yeah,
ended up building or leasing out that land and having some developers build
I see.
market rate mixed use buildings that really kind of energize the campus and create a retail corridor for the campus.
Mhm. The
Um,
GW project, how long do you think that'll take to realize their vision for this?
well, that's really hard to say. It's a private institution. It's really dependent on the funding
Mm.
for those, but the stated mission of the university is to become a comprehensive research institution um, in a global sense, and this really reflects that mission more than anything. It's a really it's a priority focus for them. So I think this will be one of the first things that they'll try to implement in the planning.
Mm. Well,
Um,
Mike, thank you very much for talking to us about this. This is a really
yeah,
interesting topic, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye on it.
great. Well, thanks
Yeah.
for having me, John.
Oh, my pleasure. And thanks to our audience for watching. This is John Caulfield from Building Design and Construction Magazine.